Good evening, everyone. Uh, we are live and we can go ahead.
Good evening, everybody. On behalf of Maharashtra Orthopedic Association, I welcome all of you for this seventh day of Maharashtra Orthopedic Association Foundation Week celebration. Today, we have an eminent speaker in the intensive care, Dr. Shivakumar Iyer, and he is going to talk on the rationale of oxygen therapy in COVID patient. Uh, I welcome all of you, respected President Dr. Shinde sir, past President Dr. Parag Sancheti sir, all the past presidents of Maharashtra Orthopedic Association, all the present and past office bearers and members of Maharashtra Orthopedic Association, and all the ladies and gentlemen who have joined this program. So I request Dr. Shinde sir to give welcome address on this occasion. Dr. Shinde sir, please.
Thank you, Prakash. Good evening, friends. On behalf of Maharashtra Orthopedic Association, I welcome you all in this wonderful webinar. I wish you all safe and healthy life in this COVID crisis. We are celebrating 30th MOA Foundation Week, and this is our 7th webinar in this series. Win over second wave of Corona is our theme for this year, and today we are discussing rationale of oxygen therapy in COVID-19 patients. Friends, we have been discussing every aspect of management of COVID crisis. So far, we have discussed about the COVID vaccines, COVID management, role of plasma therapy, psychological aspect, and also OT protocols and experience in running a COVID hospital. And I must say, all the webinars were fantastic. I congratulate my team for this excellent program. We have been seeing oxygen shortage has caused havoc in the management of COVID-19 cases. So let's understand today rationale of oxygen therapy in COVID-19 patient from Dr. Shiv Kumar Iyer. Welcome, sir. Dr. Shiv Kumar Iyer is a professor and head of the Department of Critical Care Medicine, Bharati Vidyapit University, Pune. My best wishes to today's webinar. I hand over the mic to Dr. Parag Sancheti to have a few words regarding this MOA Foundation Day and big celebration. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Jai Hind, Jai Maharashtra, Jai MOA.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Shinde sir, for those kind words. Good evening, everybody. Our chief speaker and chief faculty for today, Dr. Shiv Kumar Iyer, chief intensivist and head of department at Bharati Hospital. Our dynamic president, Dr. Ajit Shinde from Sangli. Dr. Prakash Sigedar, coordinator for the MOA Day and the MOA Foundation Week programs from Jalna. Dr. Ashok Sham, editor-in-chief of Ortho TV, past presidents, executive committee members of MOA, and members and all those who have joined this webinar through Ortho TV link. On the outset, I really want to thank Dr. Shiv Kumar Iyer, who joined our webinar at a short notice. He's been very busy since the last 1 month and has been handling more than 400 patients at Bharati Vidyapit. Bharati Vidyapit has been in the forefront in Pune to manage COVID patients, and the entire responsibility is on Dr. Shiva for taking care of those patients. Dr. Shiva was the one who actually also helped us to start a COVID ward at Sancheti Hospital in Pune, and also helps us with seeing critical patients at Sancheti Hospital. He was my senior in Beji Medical College, and I really look up to him for any advice which is related to critical patients, ICU patients, or even at a philosophical level as a friend. Dr. Shiva, thank you for coming today. And as Shinde sir has rightly said, everything about Corona is oxygen. What happens? Oxygen is lacking, saturation drops. everybody knows their saturation monitoring process now. Pulse oximeter is not a new thing anymore. And once it goes below 90, they themselves say, okay, we want to get admission, oxygen paije, oxygen bed aayega. So what is the role of oxygen? What happens in the lungs? What is it that goes wrong when this coronavirus attacks the parenchymal tissue of the lung? That is what we want to know. And none other speaker better than Dr. Shiva today, who will enlighten us. Before that, I really want to thank Dr. Ajit Shinde for taking so much efforts for this Foundation Week, and Dr. Prakash Sigedar for coordinating these activities so well and making sure that all these reach the members. And not only members, Dr. Shiva, you will be happy to hear that there are more than the MOA members who join this talk. The hits are usually more than 1,200, and I'm sure today you will have that number watching your talk, if not now, even in the next 24 hours. I want to thank in the end Dr. Ashok Sham for all his support through Ortho TV to make this possible. Thank you one and all, and I wish to hand over the mic to Dr. Prakash Sigedar for further proceedings. Thank you, sir. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shinde sir and Dr. Parag sir, for your kind words and guidance. It's my pride and privilege to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Shiv Kumar Iyer. When we thought of talk on the oxygen therapy, everybody recommended name of Dr. Shiv Kumar Iyer, and Dr. Parag sir helped us to bring him on the MOA platform. Dr. Shiv Kumar Iyer did his MD Medicine from Pune University in 1991, DNB Medicine, National Board of Examinations 1993, and European Diploma in Intensive Care 2000. He has got awards also, FICCM, Indian College of Critical Care Medicine 2010 onwards, Commonwealth Scholarship Award for UK for pursuing MSc Palliative Medicine Distance Learning at the School of Medicine, Cardiff University, Wales. So he is a still student also. His current positions are Professor and Head of Department Critical Care Medicine, Bharati Vidyapit University Medical College. Adjunct Assistant Professor, Department of Anesthesia and Intensive Care, Chinese University of Hong Kong, and ISCCM Coordinator for Basic Courses in India, run by the International Basic Assessment and Support in Intensive Care Collaborations. He is a member of many national and international associations, and he was past president of the Indian Society of Critical Care Medicine, international member of ESICM, member of ethics section of the ESICM, member of COBA Forum, member End of Life in India Task Force, illicit, and member of ICMR expert committee constituted for preparing definitions of terms used in limitations of treatment and providing palliative care at the end of life. Member of the ICMR expert committee constituted for preparing guidelines and advance directives and withdrawing the therapy. Member of FICCI, Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry, task 2018 for guidelines on advanced will and end of the life care. He has many presentations, n number of presentations to his name in the national, international journals, and he has talked on many forums, which are national and international, on the critical care medicine, and he has attended numerous conferences also for critical care medicine, and he is speaker at many national and international conferences as well. And he has completed the online course of Principles of Bioethics and Human Rights organized by the UNESCO Chair on Bioethics, University of Haifa in 2017, and he is still pursuing the MSc Palliative Medicine Distance Learning at the School of Medicine, Cardiff University, Wales since August 2018. So I am happy that we got such a eminent and expert speaker in the field of critical care medicine, and he will guide us on in the next 1 hour on rationale of oxygen therapy in COVID-19 patients. I request Dr. Shiva sir to start with his presentation. Dr. Shiva sir.
Thank you, Dr. Prakash, Dr. Ajit Shinde, and Dr. Parag Sancheti, and of course Ashok Sham from Ortho TV, through whom this program is going to reach many participants. When Parag spoke to me day before yesterday, asking me to speak on the rationale for oxygen therapy. It's in that sense, not, it won't take very much time. So I thought what I would do is to, keep the talk simple, and then maybe through interaction, we can find out people's doubts, clarify them, and also provide guidance as to what they can do, especially if they are part of the COVID-19 effort in the cities where they live. So I'm going to share my screen now. I hope you all are able to see the screen.
Yes, yes.
Very well.
Okay. So the objectives for today's talk is I'm going to take you through the pathophysiology of COVID-19 pneumonia, and then understand the clinical stages, the classification and triage of patients based on this clinical staging and classification, then understand the mechanisms of hypoxemia, how hypoxia occurs in the lungs with special reference to COVID-19, and then look at how oxygen is important and what are the sources of oxygen and what is the supply chain and how do we deliver oxygen to our patients. And then finally, some strategies for conserving oxygen. There has been a lot of talk about conserving oxygen, about oxygen shortage. We also know that the capital city of Delhi is reeling under oxygen shortage. We see ghastly images on the social media. Fortunately for us in Pune, we've been on the brink of oxygen shortage. We've been on the brink of having to transfer patients from one hospital to another because of this oxygen shortage. But fortunately, I think we were able to tide this crisis, and now we are beginning to see downswing in the number of cases. Although the number of patients in the oxygen wards and the ICUs are the same, the total number of cases seem to be going down. And so therefore, it seems that over the next few weeks, this current wave will die down. Even though that may be the case, we may expect a third wave. The reason being, there will not be enough people who have been infected or vaccinated, thereby putting us on the curve or towards herd immunity. So I think we are going to look at a third wave, so we need to prepare. Like the first wave helped us to prepare for the second wave, we should prepare even better for the third wave, and we should be able to avoid oxygen shortage. Okay, so this is about the etiopathogenesis. You can see these 4 bubbles at the bottom. And you can see that the first one shows you the entry of the SARS-CoV-2 and its replication. So it enters by attaching to the spike protein, takes over the ribosomes and the protein machinery of the cell, nasal epithelial cell. It replicates itself. After replicating, it then creates the proteins that are required for assembling the complete virion, and then the virion is released into the nasal epithelium. The next stage, this virus antigens are presented to the host immune system, and the host immune system then begins to mount an immune response. Now, whenever we think of infections or sepsis, we always say that if the immune response is regulated and if it takes a proper path, then the disease process is mild and we recover uneventfully. And this is true of the coronavirus as well. We know from data that has emerged that almost 90% of people will recover on their own. It is the remaining few that will go to the hospital. And typically, when people get admitted in a hospital, if say there are 100 people admitted in a hospital, approximately 85 of these will be in the oxygen wards and 15% will be in the ICU. These 15%, again, those people who require only HFNC or NIV or require high oxygen, those people are likely to survive. Those that go on invasive ventilation, a very small percentage of people, those are the ones who are unlikely to make it. And why does it become severe in some people? Why does it remain mild in others? I think this explanation is through the way our immune response is mounted, and the dysregulated immune response to the COVID-19 virus is what results in damage to the lungs and the typical picture of COVID-19 pneumonia. Involved in these manifestations are typically cytokines IL-1 beta, IL-6, IL-8, and then a variety of other immune mediators as well. Now, during the course of time, then what happens is the host CD4 and CD8 T cells, they begin to form memory, and this memory cells will then also induce certain B cells to become plasma cells and mount first an IgM response, which lasts for about 7 days, and then an IgG response, which will start at around 15 days and last up to 3 to 6 months. So typically if one were to measure the antibodies after you've had a COVID infection, say about 6 months back, then your antibody levels are going to be low. They are not going to be high because you're not facing an acute infection. That does not mean you do not have immunity. All it means is that your body is now quiescent, and if challenged with the coronavirus again, then it will result in an increase in the antibody levels with the help of the memory cells. Okay, so this is the etiopathogenesis, and the immune damage is what is the crux of the clinical manifestations of COVID-19. Now, this next slide is very important, and it shows you the clinical course. So there are 5 stages, as you can see. The first is the incubation stage, second is the symptomatic stage, third is the early pulmonary phase, and then we have the late pulmonary phase. And then, of course, in a small percentage of people, you may have a post-COVID syndrome, which can have various manifestations like an immune manifestation or chronic respiratory failure requiring oxygen at home, sometimes thrombotic disorders, stroke, venous thrombosis, myocardial infarction. So these are all things which may occur post-COVID. They may also occur during the course of COVID. So let's look at this in a little bit of detail. So the incubation period is the time 1 to 5 days from the time of exposure to the time symptoms manifest. And you can see the blue diamond here, it reflects viral replication. So viral replication is maximum very early, around day 7 or so after exposure to the virus. And during this time, the patients are only mildly symptomatic. So that gives us the rationale for having to follow mask and social distancing universally. If you follow that, I think we will be able to prevent sudden outbreaks, and will also be able to prevent these waves, so to say. If you're able to flatten the curve of this wave, then we'll be able to better handle it as healthcare professionals. In the symptomatic phase, typically symptoms are fever, malaise, cough, headache, diarrhea, and anosmia is a typical symptom. The symptomatic phase lasts between 5 and 11 days. And usually people who are aware, and now because awareness is high, people get themselves tested fairly early, and their RT-PCR is likely to come positive. As you can see, this is the time when the virus multiplication is at its maximum. There is something called a CT value, which is quoted on these RT-PCR reports. So CT stands for cycle threshold. It has nothing to do with the CT scan that we do, or the CT value for severity. So this CT value, typically, when viral loads are high, the CT value will be low, maybe in the region of 15 to 20, up to 25. As the disease progresses, the viral replication goes down, and the CT value will increase, which means that the cycles that are required to be able to detect the virus, they increase. So typically, when you recover, the CT value will be more than 35, which then will be reported as negative. Then you can see that the immunity kicks in. The innate immunity and the body's response, if it remains normal, a regulated immune response, then you will escape unscathed. From the symptomatic phase, you will directly go into a normal phase. You'll recover completely and will have probably long-lasting immunity. I remember Dr. Ajit Shinde asked me when we are having this discussion, are you seeing second infections, reinfections? Do we need to worry that people who have been infected in the last phase, are they likely to encounter reinfection? The chances are very few. So you can see that along with the viral replication, the immune diamond, as you can see, that increases from day 7 or 8 onwards. And there are two major manifestations of this immune response when it gets dysregulated. One is it stimulates the thrombotic system, and the second is causes immune dysfunction and the release of many immune mediators. And this results in primarily damage to the lungs. The damage to the lungs manifests clinically as breathlessness and hypoxia, and this may progress into a complete full-blown ARDS, in which case then you may require higher therapies, especially in the ICU. Okay, now next I'm going to show you where all the various strategies work. So you can see, since remdesivir is an antiviral and it inhibits replication within the nasal epithelial cells, it will act early on. Later on, when the viral replication is less, typically, about day 9 or day 10, when patients are severely ill or go into the ICU, that time remdesivir is unlikely to work, because as you can see, the viral replication has become very little. Then we have steroids. So steroids typically will come in when you realize that the regulated immune response is not exactly regulated, but is becoming dysregulated. And that is manifested or recognized clinically by the onset of hypoxia. Onset of hypoxia is when the saturation drops to below 95%, or you do a 6-minute walk test, ask a person to walk normally for 6 minutes and then check the saturation, and the saturation is less than 94%. In that case, then the person has now become requiring oxygen, and that is the time when steroids are likely to help. If you use steroids early in the stage of viral replication, then you're likely to increase the viral cytopathic response, and subsequently later the immune response also may be worse, and therefore steroids should not be used in patients who do not require oxygen. Then of course we have heparin to tackle the thrombotic manifestations. In milder cases we use thrombotic, antithrombotic doses. In severe cases we use therapeutic doses of heparin. I think as orthopedic surgeons you all are very well aware of DVT prophylaxis and sometimes of the treatment of pulmonary embolism, which requires therapeutic heparin, either unfractionated or low molecular weight. Tocilizumab, we've used it now for the last 1 year. In that last 1 year, there have been 6 trials. Of the 6 trials, 5 trials have been negative. They have all demonstrated its safety in critical care. It does, in selected cases, cause a worsening of the immunity and an increase in the secondary bacterial infections. But equally, in some other patients, it may reduce the cytokine storm and result in improvement. So it is a drug that we need to use carefully and in selected cases. And like you can see, it is almost, about day 14 of illness. So it's about, if you count out the 5 days of incubation, it's about day 10 or so when tocilizumab is going to be most effective. It will not be effective late, after you've required HFNC or NIV. You have to give it when oxygen requirement is increasing. Then oxygen, we are going to discuss that in detail. And then HFNC, NIV, through which we can give oxygen as well, and also give respiratory support. And then finally, invasive ventilation. Okay, so, the classification of COVID-19 pneumonia is based on the WHS ICMR grading. So you can see that it is based on the oxygen saturation and the respiratory rate. Mild patients are those who do not require oxygen, saturation of 95 to 100%, RR of less than 24. Moderate is 90 to 94% saturation, RR of 24 to 30, and severe is less than 90 and RR of more than 30. We use this system of triage, and this system of triage is used all over the country in all the dedicated COVID care centers. What we do is monitor the SpO2 and RR at room air. If the 3-minute walk test is negative, the person can opt for home isolation. If the 3-minute walk test or 6-minute walk test is positive, then you need to evaluate the person as to his requirement for oxygen. Requirement for oxygen will necessitate admission in oxygen wards. If in the oxygen wards, the requirement for oxygen goes beyond 8 to 10 liters, then such patients will need to be shifted to HDU ICU and will require higher levels using non-rebreather mask, 15 liters per minute, and then may go on to require HFNC, NIV or invasive ventilation. Now, it is critical in oxygen wards or in the general wards to be able to identify patients who are worsening. And for that, then pulse oximeter, respiratory rate, and the 6-minute walk test are the most useful. And at all times, given the surge and the lack or shortage of hospital beds, we need to identify patients who may not be for aggressive care early in the course of illness. So what are the types of pulse oximeters available and how do they work? So we have the finger type pulse oximeter, and now you see a profusion of such instruments on the market. So it is important to choose a good pulse oximeter, and typically there are a couple of brands which are so please speak to your biomedical engineer and choose an appropriate finger pulse oximeter. It should be reliable. It should have a CE certification preferably, and it should be certified at least by our Indian standards, the ISI. Then we have the handheld pulse oximeters. Now these are not available freely, but there are some brands which are very good, and these also are useful and they are more sturdy than the finger type pulse oximeters. Then we have this tabletop standalone pulse oximeter, and we are using this very often. So Schiller is one company which makes such tabletop pulse oximeters, which give you can place it on the table or on the bedside counter, and it remains fairly stable and it gives you good readings. And then of course, it can be part of a multi-parameter monitor when you have patients who are relatively sicker or in the ICU. So when you use a pulse oximeter, like I said, use a standard pulse oximeter. There should be no nail polish. The extremity should be warm. You should see a good waveform, or if a waveform is not available on the finger type pulse oximeter, then at least the bars should be at least 80%, so that it indicates a good signal. The infrared red signal which you see should be pulsatile, and this pulsatile infrared signal, it picks up the pulse, the oxygen of your arterial pulse, and that's how it gives you the arterial oxygen saturation. You should read after 15 to 20 seconds at least, preferably at 30 seconds. And you must use it along with the 6-minute walk test. If you don't use the 6-minute walk test, you are likely to miss early patients who are in the moderate stage. Now, these are some terms. So forgive me if this sounds very simple, but these are things which I think you need to understand. So FiO2 stands for the fraction of inspired oxygen concentration. So we know that room air is 21%, and the 1 atmosphere pressure is 760 millimeters of mercury. And if you look at 21% of 760 millimeters, it is approximately 150 millimeters. So at sea level, there will be 150 millimeters. And then as we grow higher in altitude, the oxygen, the FiO2 will drop. But at sea level and at close to sea level, it will remain around 21%. And then of course, you can give higher concentrations of oxygen, 30, 40, 50, up to 100%, using various devices, which we will be looking at. And of course, in orthopedics, we have been using at times hyperbaric oxygen therapy, where you use oxygen at higher pressures for different indications. That of course is not recommended in COVID-19. Then we have the second term, the alveolar PO2. Alveolar PO2 is the alveolar partial pressure of oxygen, and this is usually 80 to 110. Then we have the arterial PO2, denoted as P small a O2, which is 80 to 100 millimeters of mercury. Then we have the SpO2, which is the arterial oxygen saturation. This is 95 to 100%. And then in acute care, we use this term called the PaO2 FiO2 ratio, which is typically 300 to 500. And how do we calculate this? So if we say that the arterial PO2, let us say, is 100, and the FiO2 is 20%. So we don't take it as percentage, we take it as 0.2. So if you do 100 upon 0.2, so 0.2 is 2 upon 10. When it comes in the numerator, it becomes 10 upon 2, so 5. So 100 multiplied by 5, the PO2 FiO2 ratio in normal people will be 500 if the PO2 is 100. If the PO2 is 80, it will be 300. And therefore, a normal PO2 FiO2 ratio is 300 to 500. We also need to remember the concept of oxygen delivery, lest we forget that it is not just the oxygen saturation which is important, it is also its vehicle, which is hemoglobin. So 99% of oxygen that is traveled in the blood towards the tissues is carried by hemoglobin. So low hemoglobin levels will result in a low oxygen saturation. A very small amount of oxygen is dissolved oxygen. This increases with hyperbaric oxygen, but this is a very minuscule amount. And then, of course, the cardiac output is equally important. Unless the cardiac output is normal, you will not have adequate oxygen being delivered to the tissues. So 3 factors: hemoglobin, oxygen saturation, and cardiac output. Today, we are going to look more at oxygen saturation. Now, this figure is extremely important. So I want you to understand this figure, in which on the x-axis, you can see that the PO2 has been plotted on the x-axis and the percentage saturation of hemoglobin is plotted on the y-axis. So I've taken this figure from the net, but these green lines that you can see have been put by me in order to explain to you the correlation between SpO2, the PO2, and the PO2 FiO2 ratio. So you can see, please look at the x-axis. For a PO2 of 80, the oxygen saturation will be 95%. For a PO2 of 60, the saturation will be 90%. And at 90%, what happens is the flat portion of the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve enters the steep portion. That means if you get a fall in the PO2 below 80, then you're likely to get a precipitous fall in the oxygen saturation. And then you can see that in severe cases, when the PO2 is 40, then the saturation is 75%. And you can see in this, you can see in the figure next to the table next to the figure that SpO2 normal is 95 to 100%. Corresponding PO2 for that, it is 80 to 100, and PO2 FiO2 is 300 to 500. For mild, it is 90 to 94. Corresponding arterial PO2 is 60 to 79. And if you were to calculate PO2 FiO2, that would be 200 to 299. Moderate is 75 to 89 SpO2, PO2 40 to 59, and PO2 FiO2 100 to 199. In severe cases, SpO2 will be less than 75, PO2 less than 40, and PO2 FiO2 ratio will be less than 100. So in the severe pulmonary phase of COVID-19, we expect that patients will have a PO2 FiO2 ratio that is less than 200. So they'll have moderate to severe hypoxemia. So what are the mechanisms of hypoxemia? How does hypoxia develop? So for this, it is important for us to understand how oxygen enters the bloodstream. So first, of course, we have the high altitude. So like I said, if you were to go up onto the Himalayas, there our PO2 will drop. And if you're not acclimatized, then you're likely to get various syndromes related to drop in the alveolar PO2 at that level when we don't have adaptation. So adaptation to hypoxia is very important. And this adaptation to hypoxia occurs in patients with COVID-19 as well. And therefore, since it is a subacute illness, we will find patients, they will come in with PO2 or an oxygen saturation of 85, 80, and that yet they will look relatively normal because they're adapting to it. And of course, in the Sherpas who live at high altitudes, they have different mechanisms of long-term adaptation, which unfortunately do not work in the short term with cases like COVID-19. And therefore, such patients are more susceptible to the effects of hypoxia. Next, of course, we have decreased alveolar PO2. So the PO2 in the air is all right. It is 21%, like we expect. But once it enters the alveoli, it is reduced. So when will that happen? So it will happen if the alveolar PO2 is displaced by some other gas. And this other gas is usually alveolar PCO2. So if for some reason patient is drowsy or has a decreased respiratory drive or has muscle weakness for some reason, then what happens is the person is not able to breathe enough. And so he has a low alveolar ventilation, and therefore the alveolar PCO2 goes up. The alveolar PCO2 then displaces the alveolar PO2 and the alveolar PO2 drops. So in such cases, it is important to provide breaths, mechanical ventilation. Oxygen alone will not help in such situations. So this is typically seen in patients who have neurological problems and in patients who have COPD. Next, and the most important mechanism we have is the ventilation perfusion mismatch. And you can see that I've denoted as V by Q. V stands for ventilation, perfusion stands for Q. And the two mechanisms of mismatch are shunt and increased dead space. The last abnormality is a diffusion abnormality, where diffusion across the alveolar capillary membrane is affected. You know, intuitively, you might think that it's a pneumonia, so the alveolar wall is affected, and so therefore there should be a diffusion abnormality. But the most common abnormality that results in hypoxemia is ventilation perfusion mismatch, either due to shunt or due to increased dead space. So let us see how that happens, and we will relate it to COVID-19 pneumonia as well. So here you can see on the left of your screen, I have depicted shunt. You can see that the lung on the right side, on the left side, is collapsed, denoted by black collapsed alveolus. Yeah? Now this collapse may occur because of obstruction of the bronchi, but it may also occur because of pneumonia. So this is the diagrammatic that is depicted by the blue arrow. So since there is no air entering there, ventilation is less. So in this case, it is 0. And the blood is flowing past, is getting shunted past without getting oxygenated. So this is typically described as shunt. Okay. Now, as opposed to this, look at the other side, on the right side, you have a patient who's got normal alveoli, normal ventilation, but the perfusion is affected. So you can see there is a cutoff of blood flow. Now this cutoff of blood flow may be gross, as occurs with pulmonary embolism. And in COVID-19 pneumonia cases, you get a combination of both increased shunt and increased dead space. So the causes of shunt, they include collapse, consolidation, pneumonia. So in pneumonia, there is typically airspace filling that results in poorly ventilated alveoli and shunt. Pneumothorax, effusion is very uncommon in patients with COVID-19 pneumonia. Then, of course, on the other side, we have increased dead space. So on the bottom of the screen on the right side, you can see pulmonary embolism is a typical example. And like we saw in COVID-19 pneumonia, there is a tendency towards thrombosis. The D-dimer levels are high. So if you get very high D-dimer levels, then you should suspect that there may be a pulmonary embolism. If you were to do a 2D echo at this stage, then you would find RA-RV dilatation. You might find pulmonary hypertension. And if you were to do a CT pulmonary angiogram, you will find blockage of the main pulmonary artery or the right or the left pulmonary arteries. Frequently, however, even with a high D-dimer, you may find that the central pulmonary arteries are clear. And yet, there is a defect in oxygenation not entirely explained by shunt. In such cases, you must suspect microvascular thrombosis, which is a common phenomenon in patients with COVID-19 pneumonia. Then, of course, as the patient's blood pressure drops, you get decreased blood flow, and then you can get increased dead space. And because of mechanical ventilation, you may get distended air spaces. Many times, these distended air spaces will compress on the microcirculation, the capillaries, and result in less blood flow, resulting in increased dead space. So please remember that these are the mechanisms, and in each individual case, you will need to think of what the mechanism of hypoxemia is so that you can correct it adequately. The other day, I was in the ICU and taking rounds, and I saw a person with a hugely distended abdomen. He was in the hospital and he had not passed a motion for 3 days. So the distension that was there, it reduces the chest compliance because the abdomen is distended. The decrease in the chest compliance leads to less expansion of the lungs. Less expansion leads to increased shunt and results in worsening of hypoxia. So this diagnosis of the mechanism of hypoxemia at the bedside is extremely important. And so therefore, this deranged pathophysiology is extremely important to understand. we now switch gears. Now we are coming towards the end of the talk. So I have put in this picture some of the sources of oxygen. You can see on the left extreme is what we are most familiar with using. So cylinder, the normal cylinder or a jumbo cylinder attached to an oxygen regulator. Now, those of you who have hospitals of your own and have to deal with your biomedical engineer on your own, or your healthcare attendants or nurses, then they know how this oxygen regulator works. So there is a knob type thing on the top of the oxygen cylinder, which you need to turn in order to open the cylinder. And then it is important, if you're going to conserve oxygen, if you leave it half open, then you may not get to know whether the cylinder is completely empty or not. It is estimated that almost 50% of cylinders that are returned with at least 30% of the oxygen still remaining within. And part of the reason is because you've not opened the thing completely, the knob completely. So when you open the knob completely, a typical pressure within the cylinder should be very high. So it should be, 2000 pounds per square inch approximately. And then when that oxygen is being released through the oxygen flow meter, it is released at 1 to 15 liters per minute. And this 1 to 15 liters per minute, please remember, if all your connections are not tightly fitting, it will result in wastage of oxygen. So it's extremely important to realize how oxygen cylinders are used, what are the various spanners required, how does the oxygen regulator work, how do you diagnose that your oxygen cylinder, how is the regulator telling you how much oxygen is remaining. So these are very important things. Then we have, next to that, the oxygen concentrator. I have put an oxygen concentrator which can give up to 10 liters per minute. And now these are available quite easily in the market. And I think that 10 liters per minute is not a small amount of oxygen, which with this, you should be able to manage patients, many of your patients in the oxygen ward. So having oxygen concentrators, I think, is an insurance mechanism. So you must have oxygen concentrators and cylinders. The third picture is of a liquid oxygen tank. It comes in various sizes. So this is a fairly large size of liquid oxygen tank. So at Bharati Hospital, so the capacity of these tanks is counted in metric tons. And we have 2 liquid oxygen tanks which provide approximately 15 metric tons. So those who are interested, if there are questions, I will field questions about how you can know how these liquid oxygen tanks are going to work and how much oxygen is going to be used by them and how do you estimate oxygen use. The fourth picture is called a pressure swing adsorption plant. So even though it's looking small, they're fairly compact, these plants. They work on the similar principle like oxygen concentrators, and they can provide at various capacities pure medical grade oxygen. Now this medical grade oxygen, if you connect this pressure swing adsorption plant to a cylinder system, then you can even fill your cylinders with such pressure swing adsorption plants. And then according to the amount of oxygen that you require, you can choose how big your PSA plant needs to be. So typically, for a hospital, say the size of Bharati Hospital, where we have about 350 COVID patients, you would require a PSA plant which would fit into a room of about 15 by 10. So the space required is not very much. So I think a pressure swing adsorption plant is the way to go. And now it is also recommended by the Medical Council of India, the National Medical Commission, for all teaching hospitals. And I think we should go for it in other hospitals as well. So, this is going to help us to prepare for the third wave. So the time that we get now, we should make ourselves self-sufficient in oxygen. The next picture is of a cylinder bank. So those of you who are working at small hospitals are familiar with this cylinder bank. Now, cylinder bank means that you need to have an alternate cylinder bank. So if you have a requirement of 8 cylinders for your hospital, then you should have 8 cylinders spare. And if 8 cylinders get over, then once you begin to use your spare, the 8 cylinders which you have used up should get filled. Now, this will depend on good supply chain. And the supply chain has been severely affected, as we have seen in this COVID-19 pneumonia. So we've had distress calls coming in from some hospitals for helping out with cylinders. Now, the next part is about how oxygen is delivered to patients. Now, this is equally important because a lot of the wastage of oxygen will occur at this end. The first picture that you can see with two prongs in the nose and a tube that goes behind the ears and then is tightened in the front of the face on the left extreme, that is a binasal prong. With a binasal prong, you can give up to 6 to 8 liters per minute of oxygen. It's typically called a low flow device. And the low flow device, the FiO2 that is delivered depends on the person's minute ventilation and the dead space that is available for the oxygen to get diluted. And so typically, with 1 liter, you can give 24%, 2 liters, 38%, and you can go up to in the middle, that is of a face mask called the Hudson's mask. You can see the reservoir back there. You can also see the tight fitting mask, and you can see a white knob at the top of the reservoir bag. That is a one-way valve. So these masks are called non-rebreather masks. So what happens is when you start the oxygen fills up the reservoir bag. So before you start using the NRBM, you have to start the oxygen, make sure that the bag is full. And then when the patient breathes in, that time that valve opens and the air from the reservoir bag, the oxygen from the reservoir bag goes to the patient, giving enriched oxygen. So with a reservoir bag, you're able to give between 40 to 70% oxygen. Sometimes you may even go up to 80, but I think 60 to 70 is a reasonable figure. The figure at the bottom, you can see a Venturi mask and you can see color-coded Venturi valve devices. And with these Venturi valve devices, the advantage is that you are able to provide fixed high flow. So if you have a Venturi mask that is providing, that you've connected to 15 liters per minute of oxygen, and then the aperture of the nozzle or the aperture of the side holes, that decides how much air is entering by the Venturi or the Bernoulli principle. And typically, you can provide up to 30 to 40 liters per minute of an air-oxygen mixture at various oxygen concentrations. So the 15 liters per minute device, the green one, will give you 60% FiO2 and so on. And then, of course, on the right side of the panel, on the top, you can see the high flow nasal cannula. On the right bottom, you can see the NIV. And on the left bottom, you can see an invasive ventilator connected to the patient. So then what are the strategies for conserving oxygen? So evaluate your sources. Make sure that you know where oxygen is coming from. Evaluate your supply chain. Be like a hawk. Have someone in your hospital look at the supply chain. So, in our hospital, we have the biomedical person. He has to put a message on our group saying that on this day, we have used so much of oxygen. The supply person has come, the tank, the truck has come, and now we have filled it up to a capacity of so much. So our use was so much, and now our reserve is so much. And if we keep doing this, so typically, currently, what we have is a 1 to 1.5 day reserve supply, which is what you should aim for. Then minimize leakages both on the supply side. So you need to evaluate right from the liquid oxygen tank or the cylinder bank or the pressure swing adsorption plant to where the patient gets the oxygen. And then to the patient when we are giving, you need to ensure that your oxygen targets are appropriately set. So this is something which we are struggling with. We feel more is better. And 95, 96, 97, 98 ka to bahut acha hai, wah. But that is not the case. Higher oxygen levels may be detrimental. Two reasons. One is oxygen will displace the nitrogen that normally keeps the alveoli distended, and it will result in denitrogenation absorption collapse of the alveoli, leading to increased oxygen requirements. And it may also predispose to ARDS. Second, reactive oxygen radicals may be created and the immune damage may be more. So therefore, oxygen target should be 88 to 92%. Now we are veering towards trying to keep it at 91, 92. Previous targets used to be 93 to 95%. This strategy is called permissive hypoxia. Then we can use awake repositioning strategies. So if a person sits up or in the right lateral or left lateral or prone position, then oxygenation is better. So you can conserve oxygen in this way. And of course, if patients are very elderly or are terminally ill because of other reasons, then in a pandemic, we should have an appropriate system of triage, which helps us to conserve oxygen for the patients who are most likely to benefit. This is actually my last slide, and I'm now going to stop sharing my screen. The session is now open for questions. Thank you very much for a patient hearing. And thanks once again to the Maharashtra Orthopedic Association, Drs. Parag, Prakash, Dr. Ajit, and Ortho TV, Dr. Ashok. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, sir, for enlightening us on the rationale of oxygen therapy in COVID-19 patients, which is a burning issue as on today. And many of our concepts, most of the people have been solved because of your talk in a very simple language and going to the basics. So now the session is open for question and answer. If anybody has any questions on this issue, please, it is open for discussion now.
Excellent talk, Dr. Shiva. We really enjoyed your talk. Thank you so much for the input.
Thank you, Parag.
Shinde sir.
Deshpande sir is asking first question, then I will ask.
Yeah, this Vian sir.
Thank you very much, sir. At the outset, I will thank you for clearing our doubts and our concepts. Shiva sir,
Yes,
I
sir.
have a question. What is your strategy in chronic obstructive lung diseases wherein hypoxia is a drive for their
Right.
ventilation? So
Right.
how do you handle these cases, or how should we handle these cases?
So, so there are 3-4 points in this. First is, it is very helpful if you know the baseline oxygen saturation of the patient. So if you know that this person has a resting PO2 of say 50 to 55 and has a resting oxygen saturation of between 85 and 90, then you need to appropriately reduce your goals. And you would accept between 85 and 90 saturation for such patients. So the goal is extremely important. Now, when you give oxygen to these patients, if you were to give higher concentrations of oxygen, as you very rightly pointed out, what can happen is the hypoxic drive may go away. If the hypoxic drive goes away, then the CO2 levels are likely to build up and the patient will become drowsy and go into CO2 narcosis. But, if the saturation levels for a patient drop below 85%, then hypoxia will kill him. So you cannot deprive such patients of oxygen. You'll have to give oxygen. And if by oxygen you find that the CO2 levels are going up, then such patients will need to be managed with the help of ventilation. Ventilation, now, fortunately for us, non-invasive ventilation is available. And such patients, especially with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, do extremely well with non-invasive ventilation. And in fact, using non-invasive ventilation, the positive airway pressure that you're able to provide will also improve the oxygenation. So these are some of the things that you need to keep in mind when you have patients with COPD who present with COVID-19 pneumonia.
I have one more question. See, these days doctors are also getting more and more infected. And
Yes.
being doctor, when the oxygen is available,
Yes.
they keep switch on the oxygen in the room and
Yes.
take themselves couple of liters per minute.
Right.
Is there any hazard apart from wasting this useful resource? Actually, we should use the resources very mindfully. We should save these resources. In other words, are there any hazards of using oxygen unnecessarily?
So, I did mention that the hazards of oxygen therapy now are not well documented in adults. In neonates and in young children, it is well described that you can get, it's called the retinopathy of prematurity, ROP. So that is one thing which occurs. So with oxygen, like hypoxic, it's called the hypoxic paradox. So both hypoxia and hyperoxia, they lead to stimulation of a variety of mediators in the body. So this variety of mediators is both, on one side is the immune mediators, which increase inflammation. And on the other side are the factors that increase, it's called VEGF, so the vascular endothelium growth factors. And we utilize this therapeutically. You have a diabetic ulcer that is not healing, or you've got a chronic orthopedic problem for which you're going to use hyperbaric oxygen. So what we want is you give more oxygen and you stimulate a process of angiogenesis in that part. But in patients who have COVID-19 pneumonia, this angiogenesis proliferation is going to probably lead later on to fibrosis. So one is it can increase inflammation. It may predispose to fibrosis. And the third thing that can happen, not in patients who are in their rooms, but in patients who are on the ventilator, what can happen is if you give higher concentrations of oxygen, the nitrogen from the alveoli gets displaced. And since the alveoli are filled with oxygen now, oxygen can easily diffuse across the alveolar capillary membrane and the alveoli can collapse. So this process of collapse is called denitrogenation absorption collapse. So these are some of the hazards of oxygen. And now we've been hearing of fires because of oxygen therapy and stuff like that. So we must never forget that using oxygen irrationally or keeping the oxygen on, even a small spark or a short circuit can spark a fire. So you need to have your fire protocols properly vetted in all hospitals, of course, larger hospitals and smaller hospitals. So these are some of the hazards of oxygen therapy. Thank you, sir.
Shinde sir.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
My question is not related to oxygen. My question is related to whether you have used in your ICU methylene blue, and what is that nitric oxide and oxygen relation, ferrous to ferric. Can we enlighten on this?
So, nitric oxide is a very powerful vasodilator. And it has been used extensively, nitric oxide, in mechanical ventilation in patients with ARDS. So methylene blue, it helps generate nitric oxide. And through the generation of nitric oxide, it causes pulmonary vasodilatation. So by improving pulmonary blood flow, it can help to improve ventilation perfusion match. In addition, in the microcirculation, by causing capillary vasodilatation, it can improve peripheral blood flow. So if you improve peripheral blood flow, the supply of oxygen to the tissues, delivery of oxygen to the tissues may be improved. But unfortunately, these are all theoretical considerations. And there are people who swear by the use of methylene blue. There are some hospitals in Pune also who are using, some hospitals in Gujarat, which are using a lot of methylene blue. Unfortunately, to date, there is not even a single randomized controlled trial that has shown benefit from methylene blue. So in patients with severe vasoplegic shock, sometimes the use of methylene blue, a cocktail of methylene blue plus thiamine plus vitamin C in resistant vasoplegic shock may help. But unfortunately, its use for ARDS is based more on whim and fancy rather than science.
Welcome, Dr.
Yeah.
Sunil. Dr. Sunil Patil has also joined.
Yeah, welcome, Patil
I
sir,
introduce
welcome.
him. Sir, he is the Dr. Sunil Patil, who is the deputy dean at Bharti Sangli, and he is an orthopedic surgeon.
Yeah. Namaskar.
Namaskar, sir. Shiva, sir, we have already spoken to you on phone and I had attended your lecture also.
Yes.
One question to you is, our patients from the age of 45 to say 55 are maintained well on NRM for about 4 to 5 days.
Yes.
And suddenly they drop out with oxygen saturation falling down around 50, 55 and
Yes.
they collapse.
Yes.
So this usually happens, in the odd hours, weird hours of night.
Yes.
So what would you suspect the cause of all this?
Yes. So first is that there is a limited set of differentials for sudden worsening of hypoxia.
Okay.
So sudden worsening of hypoxia, the most important and dangerous cause is pulmonary embolism.
Mm-hmm.
So if there is a pulmonary thrombosis and the blood supply to the lungs is blocked, then there is a sudden increase in dead space and that results in hypoxia. That is the first differential. The second differential is, after 4-5 days, like you said, age group of 40 to 55, part of the treatment of COVID-19 is steroids.
Yeah.
So once you've given steroids, there is always the possibility of a secondary bacterial infection. Now, in the odd hours of night, it should not be sudden. So generally, a secondary bacterial infection will typically brew over about 12 hours to 15 hours. Unfortunately, what happens is, because of the surge and because of our less nurses, less doctors, we are not able to pick this up in time.
Right.
So the slightest amount of tachycardia, or an increase in the oxygen requirement during the day, it should alert you to the possibility of this happening. And so you should pick up secondary bacterial infection before the sudden collapse happens. If you can do that, then appropriate escalation of antibiotic will help.
Right.
That is the second differential. Now, the third differential is something which occurs as part of COVID-19 pneumonia, what is called a cytokine storm.
Okay, yeah.
Now, this cytokine storm is because there is a sudden increase in the markers.
Yeah.
So, again, the suspicion of cytokine storm will arise with increase in the markers. So you might want to set up a mechanism in your place whereby every third day you monitor. You don't need to monitor all the markers. You can probably monitor CRP and D-dimer, which I think are the most important. The D-dimer will also help you to pick up incipient pulmonary thrombosis. And then, of course, there is the fourth differential of worsening of the COVID-19 itself in its course. So you're beginning now to get fibrosis to set in. And then in such cases, the course is not going to be very good. They're going to go on to require 100% oxygen, then go on to invasive ventilation and not do so well. Now, in understanding the mechanisms of hypoxemia, I did say that two things. One is you need to think of causes of increased shunt and of increased dead space. So use of oxygen is going to increase the amount of dead space that occurs. It is going to result in collapsed alveoli, resulting in increased shunt. So those need to be looked at, and doing physiotherapy, taking deep breaths, using awake repositioning protocols, all these things will help to prevent such episodes from happening. So these are some of the preventive measures. And of course, sometimes it does happen suddenly and you're completely stuck. Another important reason for it to occur at night is the oxygen comes off, the person goes to sleep, you don't pay attention, or you are able to pick it up in time, or the person decides on his own to go to the toilet. So the protocol should be that anyone who's requiring more than 8 liters per minute of oxygen should be told to take a bedpan or a urinal and not walk towards the toilet. Then meal time. During meal time, they remove the oxygen, and that time they desaturate. So these are all important reasons.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Sir, which form of steroids you are using in your?
So at Pune Bharati Hospital, we are using dexamethasone, and we are using 8 milligrams once a day, which is what is recommended by the large recovery trial, which was carried out in the UK. There are multiple observational studies which have used methylprednisolone, but to date there is no.
Yes, sir,
there is no randomized controlled trial which has shown that methylprednisolone should be used and not dexamethasone. So we prefer to use dexamethasone. It is cheap, it is easy to use. Methylprednisolone needs to be given as an infusion. Dexamethasone can be given as a bolus. So what we do is to improve and to make it easy for our nurses, we give the 8 milligrams dexamethasone as a single dose in the morning. So एकदाच 8 milligrams दिलं की दिवसभराचा dexamethasone दिला गेलाय असं होतं. So we are preferring to use dexamethasone.
Sir, while the patient is on non-invasive or NRM,
yes,
how do you go about with the feeding? Because once they remove the mask, they become hypoxic, and then feeding becomes a problem. Though IV line protocol is there,
yes,
but an RT cannot be put in because of the venti mask cannot be snugly feeding. So how do we manage feeding on patients with NRM or say venti mask?
So two things, for the patients who are less sick, all of them must have a binasal prong at the bedside.
Yeah.
So when they're going to eat, you remove the NRM, they'll go on to the binasal prong. And if you find after you put the binasal prong that it is drastically dropping the oxygen saturation, then such patients are going to be very risky. So in such patients, you can put a Ryle's tube. A Ryle's tube is not contraindicated in patients who have a tight-fitting face mask. Yeah.
Right.
Only it is uncomfortable, and in conscious patients, they don't tolerate it very well. So Ryle's tube feeding would be the first choice. And now as a protocol, especially in summer, what we've done is we make sure that we give at least 30 ml per kg body weight of IV fluids.
Yeah.
So 2 लिटर बॉटलचे पाण्याचे बॉटल भरून ठेवायचे आणि 2 लिटर म्हणजे 4 पॉइंट तरी त्यांना द्यायचे सो दॅट दे डोंट गेट डिहायड्रेट. तर असं आम्ही फॉलो करतो. अदरवाईज असे पेशंट्स जे रॅपिडली डिटेरिएट होतात, डिसॅच्युरेट होतात फीडिंगच्या वेळेला, then you have no option sometimes but to then consider invasive ventilation so that then you can feed them appropriately with a feeding tube in place. So the options are limited.
Another problem is ventilators getting warm and hot.
Yes.
How do we go about with them?
मग आम्ही काय करतो, व्हेंटिलेटरच्या मागे एक कूलर ठेवायचा किंवा पंखा ठेवायचा. So by circulating the air around the ventilator, you are able to cool the ventilator a little bit. Now most ventilators have a cooling mechanism of their own, but they are not built for the high temperatures that we have in our wards. So that is a problem. So you need to keep a watch. So we have managed that with coolers, with standing fans. अशाने आम्ही मॅनेज करायचा प्रयत्न करतो जिथे एसी नाहीये तिथे.
पण एसी तर ऍज इट इज लावून नाही असं म्हणतात ना.
नाही, आताचे रेकमेंडेशन्स तुम्ही बघितले ना, so there are two schools of thought, whether it's an airborne, completely airborne virus or whether it's a droplet infection with a small amount of airborne. So what we've understood is that it is a droplet infection with a small amount of airborne. आणि कॉन्टॅक्ट सर्फेसेस जे आहेत त्याच्यावरती ते जास्त काळ टिकत नाही. So the predominant method of spread is droplet, and that happens generally when the mask is down and when social distancing is lost. And so therefore you don't need to worry about using AC or using fans. So fans ने पण तेच होतं ना की एरोसॉल क्रिएट होतोय असं आपण म्हणू शकतो. सो जेव्हा आपण व्हेंटिलेटर वापरतोय तर व्हेंटिलेटरच्या दोन्ही एंड्सला आपण जर फिल्टर लावला तर द फिल्टर विल ट्रॅप द कोरोना व्हायरस अँड व्हॉट एव्हर एअर द व्हेंटिलेटर थ्रोज आउट दॅट विल नॉट हॅव एन एरोसॉल. सो तिथे पंखा वापरायला हरकत नाही.
पण व्हेंटिलेटरला पंखा आणि फिल्टर दोन्ही असतंय, पण ते दोन्ही ठराविक काळानंतर इट बिकम्स नॉन फंक्शनिंग
होतं ना. मग फिल्टर बदलायचं आणि then over a period of time now you realize which ventilators are likely to function better in our hot conditions. मग तसं आपल्याला आता फॉर एक्झाम्पल आपण भारती सांगलीमध्ये आणि भारती पुणेमध्ये we are using the Vela. So it's a turbine flow generator. In fact, turbine fans which rotate at a high speed should get very heated, but we have found reasonably good results. One way to avoid that, they say, is to use a compressed air source. So central compressed air असला तर मग ते हिटिंग थोडंसं कमी होतं आणि मग त्याच्यात ऑक्सिजन पण येत असतं ना, सो ऑक्सिजन गार असतं, तर त्याच्याने मग थोडंसं कूलिंग प्रोव्हाइड होतं.
Thank you very much, sir, for guiding us. And
Sir, any experience with using piroxicam or immunosuppressant in?
So piroxicam is a typical non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug. So early in the course, when fever or body ache or things are not getting settled with paracetamol alone, I think piroxicam or etoricoxib or some of the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, they have a role in reducing the inflammation, in reducing body ache and reducing the fever as well. So काय होतं, fever खूप दिवस चालू राहिला, लोकांना वाटतं आपण स्टिरॉइड्स वापरू ऑक्सिजनची रिक्वायरमेंट नसताना, पण तेव्हा स्टिरॉइड्स वापरण्यापूर्वी ऑक्सिजन रिक्वायरमेंट नसते तर मग पिरॉक्सिकॅम वापरू शकतो.
Is it mandatory to use intravenous steroid? Can we use oral steroids?
No. Oral steroid equally good. So you can use oral dexamethasone. 4 milligrams 2 tablets द्यायचे.
That's what I wanted to in fact ask you. Is it mandatory?
No, not at all mandatory. Oral is good, better.
Fine. Thank you.
so thank you very much, sir, for guiding us, and it was a nice discussion, live discussion. There may be many questions, but as that we are exceeding our time. I request our President Shinde sir to conclude this session.
Thank
Shinde
you.
sir.
Congratulations, Shiva sir. It was a nice presentation. Most of all our queries are cleared by you. And this is a great experience. Thank you for delivering a nice presentation and lecture.
Thank you, sir.
On behalf of Maharashtra Orthopedic Association, I thank Dr. Shiva sir for coming on a short notice and guiding us on a very important topic of rational use of oxygen therapy in COVID-19. I am thankful to all the who have joined, Dr. Sunil Patil, Dr. Mukund Doshi, who is my classmate, and all others who have joined for this session. I am thankful to our President, Dr. Shinde sir, for taking efforts for celebrating this MOA Foundation Week. Thank you, Dr. Parag sir, Dr. V.N. Deshpande sir, Dr. Ashok Sham, and all those who are viewing this program live. I am thankful to all of them. And with the permission of President, I declare that this session is over. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.